A murder in Tollington Park. On the 25th of July 1910, Miss Eliza Barrow was looking for a place to live. She wanted either a small flat or a set of furnished rooms in a respectable house, and in a respectable part of town. She found what she was looking for when she answered an advertisement for a top-floor room in a spacious house in Tollington Park in Islington, London. The house was owned by a middle-class gentleman named Frederick Seddon. He lived in the house with his wife Margaret and their 5 children. Within 2 years, one member of the household would be dead from arsenic poisoning, and another would be hanged for murder. It was a tale that gripped England, and led to many questions about what exactly went on in that utterly respectable house in Tollington Park. Frederick Seddon was born in Lancashire, England, in 1872. Tall and upright-looking, at a young age he established a career with the Manchester Industrial Insurance Company, where he quickly proved himself astute with money. In time he became a respected insurance agent and mortgage salesman. This was in the latter part of the 19th century, when England had an empire, and the middle classes were on the rise. It was possible to do well, if an industrious young man from the lower middle orders applied himself. And this is precisely what Frederick Seddon did. He followed the well-trodden path of upward mobility. In time he married a respectable young girl called Margaret, had several children, and was initiated into the Freemasons. In 1909 he purchased a 14-room house in Tollington Park, near Finsbury Park in London. It was a respectable address. The house itself was large by modern standards, consisting of a basement floor where a cook toiled in the kitchen, the main floor which held the formal rooms, and above these 2 further floors for bedrooms. In the Edwardian era, the Seddons enjoyed a life of comfortable upward mobility, common to the middle classes in England at the time. However, Frederick Seddon was not possessed of the qualities required of an Edwardian gentleman. His abiding passion was money. He was thrifty certainly, but more than that he was perhaps miserly, and always on the lookout for the next financial opportunity. In 1910, just such an opportunity presented itself in the shape of Miss Eliza Barrow, who was looking for a place to live. Eliza Barrow was an English eccentric if ever there was one. She was a 49-year-old spinster who, like Seddon, had a miserly attitude towards money, and she didn't trust banks. She was overweight and hard of hearing. But Eliza Barrow was a woman of independent means, a somewhat unique circumstance for many women of the period. She had been left a legacy which included stocks and property, and from this she drew a handsome yearly income. In 1910 she was living with her cousins, the Vanderhoys. Following a quarrel with these relatives, Miss Barrow mentioned to her neighbour Mr. Seddon that she was looking for new, inexpensive lodgings. Mr. Seddon's eyes widened with delight, and he suggested she rent the top floor of his imposing house near Finsbury Park. Miss Barrow accepted. Miss Barrow moved in with her ward, Ernie Grant, the 8-year-old child of her deceased friend, and a couple by the name of Hook. However, the Hooks didn't last long at Tollington Park. They left following a quarrel with the temperamental Miss Barrow. But before taking their leave, Mr. Hook made a point of accusing Mr. Seddon of orchestrating their departure, and of being after her money. Mr. Seddon and Miss Barrow had something in common: they both loved money. Especially gold. Seddon soon discovered that his lodger had significant investments in India stock, the leasehold on various properties, and significant sums of cash in a locked tin box which she kept beside her at all times. Miss Barrow was perhaps an easily trusting woman. But she was also paranoid. For reasons of security, she insisted that Ernie, her ward, sleep in the same bed as her even when she was unwell. Miss Barrow's distrust of banks perhaps allowed the Seddons to quickly gain her trust. Margaret Seddon was a hard-working woman from the north of England, rather downtrodden and burdened by the daily tasks of domesticity. Frederick was a trusted man in his community, financially astute, and a man in love with money as much as Miss Barrow. In many ways Frederick and Eliza Barrow were kindred spirits. In the space of a few months, Mr. Seddon had managed to persuade Miss Barrow to hand all her stocks and property over to him, in exchange for a lifetime annuity. He offered generous terms too, giving her £30 a year more than she might have got with another insurance company. It was a good deal, it seemed. How could Miss Barrow turn it down? On the 14th of October 1911, Miss Barrow and Mr. Seddon signed on the dotted line. Miss Barrow could not realize it at the time, but she was signing her own death warrant. Over the following months, Seddon acquired other properties owned by Miss Barrow, in exchange for an increase in her annuity. Then, accompanied by Margaret Seddon, Miss Barrow withdrew her savings from the bank, amounting to £216, a large sum in those days. Everything Miss Barrow had once owned was now in the possession of Frederick Seddon. For the next 6 months, Miss Barrow and Ernie lived a contented life at Tollington Park. They even went on holiday with the Seddons to Southend. Tenants and landlord seemed to get on very well. But then things changed. On their return from holiday, the Seddons' daughter Maggie was dispatched on an uneventful domestic errand. She was sent to the local chemist with a 3-penny bit to buy fly papers. Impregnated with arsenic, Edwardian fly papers were often soaked in a bowl of water and left around the house to kill the summer pests during the height of summer. Miss Barrow had several placed in her bedroom. Within days, Miss Barrow complained of stomach pains, sickness and diarrhea, and a doctor was summoned. Dr. Swan prescribed morphine and promised to return to check up on her. When he came back several days later, he saw that Miss Barrow's health had deteriorated, and he insisted she go to hospital. But Miss Barrow refused. Neither Miss Barrow nor Mr. Seddon approved of paying to be nursed back to health, and it was agreed that she should remain at Tollington Park where Miss Barrow could be cared for by Mrs. Seddon. But despite all her good efforts, Mrs. Seddon could not ensure that Miss Barrow took her medicine regularly. On only one occasion did Mr. Seddon administer Miss Barrow's medicine personally. On the 13th of September, Seddon went to the theatre. He returned late. At 11:30 p.m., Ernie ran downstairs asking for help. The Seddons ran upstairs and found Miss Barrow on the floor, writhing in agony and crying, "I am dying." She was lifted back into bed. Mrs. Seddon remained with her. Ernie was sent to sleep in another room. Frederick Seddon remained on the landing reading a newspaper. It was a long, uneasy night. Miss Barrow suffered dreadfully. There was no relief. And early the next morning, at 6:30 a.m., Miss Barrow died an agonizing death. Immediately after Miss Barrow's death, Mr. Seddon visited the doctor who, curiously, issued a death certificate without seeing the body. He confirmed the death to be the result of natural causes. Later he claimed that he didn't view the body because he was overworked, as a result of a cholera epidemic which had broken out at the time. Mr. Seddon then interviewed a local undertaker and negotiated the most inexpensive funeral possible for his former lodger. Moreover, Seddon managed to extract a commission from the undertaker. On the same day, he sent young Ernie away to live with his relatives. Miss Barrow was entitled to be interred in the Barrow family vault, but on Seddon's instruction, she was buried in a common burial plot in Islington Cemetery on the 16th of September. None of her relatives were present. The Vonderhays soon wondered why they hadn't heard anything from their cousin, Miss Barrow. Mr. Vonderhay called at Tollington Park and was shocked to learn from the maid that Miss Barrow was dead and buried, not a week before. Rightfully suspicious, the Vonderhays pressed further. They visited the Seddons several days later. Mr. Seddon produced a copy of a letter he said he sent to the Vonderhays inviting them to the funeral, a black-edged funeral card, and a copy of Miss Barrow's will made 3 days before her death in which she left everything to Ernie Grant. Seddon might have convinced his suspicious guests that they hadn't learned of the funeral because his invitation had got lost in the post, if his manner wasn't quite so cold and unfeeling. All he had to do was express some sympathy and perhaps condole with the Vanderhoys' loss. As it was, Seddon expressed his irritation at being questioned. Moreover, he insisted that he did not have time to waste on inquisitive people. To emphasize this point, he kept staring at his pocket watch. The pocket watch had belonged to Miss Eliza Barrow. Perhaps not unsurprisingly, the Vonderhays called in the police, who agreed to exhume the body on the 15th of November 1911. A pathologist from the Home Office, Sir William Wilcox, aided by a young Bernard Spilsbury, discovered 2.5 grains of arsenic in her body, more than a fatal dose. Seddon was at home working on his accounts when the police came to the door. He was arrested on the 4th of December 1911 for the willful murder of Eliza Barrow. Exclaiming that such a charge was absurd, he asked the police, "Are you going to arrest my wife as well?" In fact, they did. On the 15th of January, the police also arrested Margaret Seddon and committed husband and wife to trial. Frederick Seddon was represented by Sir Edward Marshall Hall, a man famed for his razor-sharp legal mind and rhetorical flourishes during cross-examination. Margaret Seddon was represented by Mr. Gervase Rental. The Attorney General, Sir Rufus Isaacs, acted for the prosecution. Husband and wife pleaded not guilty. Mr. Seddon had a lot going for him during the trial. Nobody had seen him administer any poison to Miss Barrow. He summed his own position up thus: "I am willing to admit that the woman died of poison. I admit that I benefited considerably by her death, but you cannot prove that I gave her the poison. I may have brought food to her, and unless the prosecution can, beyond all possible doubt, prove that poison was in that food and placed there by me, you must return a verdict of not guilty." He retained his confident detachment throughout the trial. But Sir Rufus Isaacs was more than a match for him. Sir Rufus Isaacs challenged Seddon's financial dealings with forensic detail. Seddon had prepared answers to every question put to him, and he rather looked forward to his turn in the witness box. However, Sir Rufus Isaacs caught Seddon off guard and got him to admit that he hadn't liked Miss Barrow at all, thereby successfully exposing the defendant as an unfeeling man obsessed with money. Questioned about his penchant for counting his gold immediately after Miss Barrow's death, Seddon's composure snapped. "I am not a degenerate," he snapped back from the witness box. "That would make it out that I was a greedy, inhuman monster. The suggestion is scandalous." Then, after a long pause, he added with a smirk, "I would have all day to count it." While Seddon made a poor impression in the witness box, his wife Margaret was revealed to be a pathetic figure. She broke down frequently, seemed bewildered by the proceedings, and the court was ultimately convinced that she was not in the same league as her husband. On the 10th day of the trial, the jury retired to consider their verdict. 1 hour later they returned and found Frederick Seddon guilty of murder. His wife was acquitted. Seddon then made a speech to the judge, invoking their common membership of the Masonic Order, and imploring his Masonic brother to have mercy on him and reiterating his innocence. "I declare before the great architect of the universe, I am not guilty, my lord." The judge, apparently tearful, urged Seddon to make peace with his maker before donning the black cap to pronounce a death sentence on Seddon. Despite the widespread belief that Seddon was guilty, there was nonetheless some disquiet about the validity of the scientific evidence which had condemned him. Some suggested that a high level of arsenic could have found its way into Miss Barrow's body post-mortem via the coffin. A public campaign gathered thousands of signatures from people dissatisfied with the verdict and death sentence. Seddon's solicitors immediately launched an appeal. It was dismissed in the appeals court on 2nd of April 1912. Seddon would hang. Before his scheduled execution, Seddon sent for his solicitor. Preoccupied with money to the end, he asked him how much the sale of his furniture had fetched at auction. Disappointed by the paltry sums, Seddon despondently said, "That's done it," and resigned himself to his fate. Seddon was hanged by John Ellis and Thomas Pierpoint at Pentonville Prison on the 18th of April 1912. The trial soon faded from people's minds because news of the Titanic sinking only days before the verdict was uppermost in people's minds. Sir Edward Marshall Hall concentrated all his efforts on saving Seddon from the gallows. Despite his many triumphs in the courtroom, he was unsuccessful in sparing Seddon his life. Privately, he called it the blackest case he'd ever worked on. 7 months after her husband's execution, Margaret Seddon remarried a man from Liverpool called Cameron, and moved to America with her children. She died there in 1946. It seems obvious that Frederick Seddon murdered Eliza Barrow for her money. Not only did he have the motive, but certainly the opportunity as well. It would have been easy to make use of the flypaper. He could have brought up a glass of water for Miss Barrow laced with the poison. He could even have sent his daughter Maggie upstairs with it. Perhaps Frederick and his wife were both in on it. If they were, Margaret Seddon was extremely lucky to have been viewed by the jury as an innocent, pathetic figure. Did she get away with murder? When Seddon was arrested, he did ask the police if his wife would be arrested too. In a way, the real victim in this case was Ernest Grant, Miss Barrow's faithful ward. He lost the one person who looked after him, and was sent away without even getting the chance to attend Miss Barrow's funeral. If you enjoyed this true crime story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Thank you all for listening.